Welcome. Perhaps we can begin today's episode by asking how you are. With this question, maybe you can just be aware of how the energy is in the body. Is the body agitated? Is it calm, anxious, relaxed? None of this needs to be changed, just be aware and bringing the awareness to the body itself. And allow the awareness to take care of the body, what needs to be circulated in the body, and what needs to run its course will happen. And what has the mind absorbed today? Just perhaps move the attention to the mind. How's the mind doing? And this is not asked from the space of the person, but from the place of stillness, the place of neutrality, where there's no investment, there's no trying to do something, there's no achievement, there's no identity, there's no comparison, there's no comparing, there's no I should be doing this better, or I haven't done this enough. There's just the noting of the emotions or thoughts, what the mind has consumed through conversations, interactions, through books or television. Can you note what the mind has absorbed today? And in this observation, what needs to be done will happen. There may not be a need to sift through each action or set of thoughts or what the body has been through. Just in the observation itself, the medicine is within that. What needs to unfold in the stillness of your being. What unfolds in that space is what is needed for you. Perhaps you can note that with certain thoughts or actions, they were done from the person. It may be clear to see that what I did this morning, or a conversation I had, or the thoughts that went through my mind, the emotions, that was from the perspective or from the identifying with the person. Quite often in the space of now, things are not figured out but are revealed. There's no sort of going through each thing and seeing, okay, is this right, or could this be done better? It's almost in a large brushstroke of presence. All at once, there things are clear. Certain things you may have done immediately come up to the surface as perhaps that may not have synced, that may not sink in with the practice you are aiming to do each day. It may be clear to see that, oh, in this occasion I had, I consumed too much of this or that. Or I was pulled out of my centered space. It's clear to see. And now you can, in some ways, visualize the day ahead, what's left of the day. Even if you're listening to this before going to bed, there's still part of the day is remaining. Going to bed now, there may be a renewness, a resurgence of awareness, instead of thinking of what you need to do tomorrow. Now there may be a perspective of there's an opportunity to be alive, to be fully present. And there's an appreciation for the moment that is available, that a moment that has opened up, that you can actually be present in. And in something so simple, there's a deep acknowledgement, a deep appreciation for that. Something that's completely invisible to the mind. And we can begin with now. As you are listening, this moment is not to be overlooked. You are not simply just listening to the words that are being said, and maybe you're doing something else while listening. You're maybe on a walk or driving, or yes, you can be aware this is not just to fill the time. This is not a little bit of entertainment or something to distract. This is an opportunity to fully embrace this moment, this one moment, the always now, and to wake up into the stillness, not as a doing, but as a being. And reminding your true self of your essence, of your nature, which is not in thoughts, which is not in doing, but in the simple act of being in this moment. And not being as an idea or concept, but being in a place where there is no next, there is no commentary, there's no judgments, there there is just a flow of now. And the ever stable place of now. Changes may be happening, the weather, people's moods, our bodies are changing every moment in constant flux. But there is always the stability of the present moment. Where all change takes place in the unchanging. In the ever-present now. And you don't have to be present for the next hours, weeks, or months, years. Just this moment. That is all that is required. Just take care of the now. And let go of disappointments. Let go of memories or commentary that you haven't been present enough. There's no place for that, there's no space for that here in this moment. There is only the witness being aware of awareness. So we read the first section of the book A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle, and we can now continue the next section, which is titled The Purpose of This Book. Is humanity ready for a transformation of consciousness, an inner flowering so radical and profound that compared to it, the flowering of plants, no matter how beautiful, is only a pale reflection? Can human beings lose the density of their conditioned mind structures and become like crystals or precious stones, so to speak, transparent to the light of consciousness? Can they defy the gravitational pull of materialism and materiality and rise above identification with form that keeps the ego in place and condemns them to imprisonment within their own personality? The possibility of such a transformation has been the central message of the great wisdom teachings of humankind. The messengers, Buddha, Jesus, and others, not all of them known, were humanity's early flowers. They were precursors, rare and precious beings. A widespread flowering was not yet possible at that time, and their message became largely misunderstood and often greatly distorted. It certainly did not transform human behavior, except in a small minority of people. Is humanity more ready now than at the time of those early teachers? Why should this be so? What can you do, if anything, to bring about or accelerate this inner shift? What is it that characterizes the old egoic state of consciousness? And by what signs is the new emerging consciousness recognized? These and other essential questions will be addressed in this book. More important, this book itself is a transformational device that has come out of the arising new consciousness. The ideas and concepts presented here may be important, but they are secondary. They are no more than signposts pointing toward awakening. As you read, a shift takes place within you. This book's main purpose is not to add new information or beliefs to your mind, or to try to convince you of anything, but to bring about a shift in consciousness, that is to say, to awaken. In that sense, this book is not interesting. Interesting means you can keep your distance, play around with ideas and concepts in your mind, agree or disagree. This book is about you. It will change your state of consciousness, or it will be meaningless. It can only awaken those who are ready. Not everyone is ready yet, but many are, and with each person who awakens, the momentum in the collective consciousness grows, and it becomes easier for others. If you don't know what awakening means, read on. Only by awakening can you know the true meaning of the word. A glimpse is enough to initiate the awakening process, which is irreversible. For some, that glimpse will come while reading this book. For many others who may not even have realized it, the process has already begun. This book will help them recognize it. For some, it may have begun through loss or suffering. For others, through coming into contact with a spiritual teacher or teaching, through reading The Power of Now, or some other spiritually alive and therefore transformational book, or any combination of the above. If the awakening process has begun in you, the reading of this book will accelerate and intensify it. An essential part of the awakening is the recognition of the unawakened you, the ego as it thinks, speaks and acts, as well as the recognition of the collectively conditioned mental processes that perpetuate the unawakened state. That is why this book shows the main aspects of the ego and how they operate in the individual as well as in the collective. This is important for two related reasons. The first is that unless you know the basic mechanics behind the workings of the ego, you won't recognize it, and it will trick you into identifying with it again and again. This means it takes you over, an imposter pretending to be you. The second reason is that the act of recognition itself is one of the ways in which awakening happens. When you recognize the unconsciousness in you, that which makes the recognition possible is the arising consciousness, is awakening. You cannot fight against the ego and win, just as you cannot fight against darkness. The light of consciousness is all that is necessary. You are that light. So I'm going to read one more section, and this one is titled, Our Inherited Dysfunction. If we look more deeply into humanity's ancient religions and spiritual traditions, we will find that underneath the many surface differences, there are two core insights that most of them agree on. The words they use to describe those insights differ, yet they all point to a twofold fundamental truth. The first part of this truth is the realization that the normal state of mind of most human beings contains a strong element of what we might call dysfunction or even madness. Certain teachings at the heart of Hinduism perhaps come closest to seeing this dysfunction as a form of collective mental illness. They call it Maya, the veil of delusion. Ramana Maharshi, one of the greatest Indian sages, bluntly states, the mind is Maya. Buddhism uses different terms. According to the Buddha, the human mind in its normal state generates dukkha, which can be translated as suffering, unsatisfactoriness, or just plain misery. He sees it as a characteristic of the human condition. Wherever you go, whatever you do, says the Buddha, you will encounter dukkha, and it will manifest in every situation sooner or later. According to Christian teachings, the normal collective state of humanity is one of original sin. Sin is a word that has been greatly misunderstood and misinterpreted. Literally translated from the ancient Greek in which the New Testament was written, to sin means to miss the mark, as an archer who misses the target. So to sin means to miss the point of human existence. It means to live unskillfully, blindly, and thus to suffer and cause suffering. Again, the term, stripped of its cultural baggage and misinterpretations, points to the dysfunction inherent in the human condition. The achievements of humanity are impressive and undeniable. We have created sublime works of music, literature, painting, architecture, and sculpture. More recently, science and technology have brought about radical changes in the way we live and have enabled us to do and create things that would have been considered miraculous even 200 years ago. No doubt, the human mind is highly intelligent, yet its very intelligence is tainted by madness. Science and technology have magnified the destructive impact that the dysfunction of the human mind has upon the planet, other life forms, and upon humans themselves. That is why the history of the 20th century is where that dysfunction, that collective insanity, can be most clearly recognized. A further factor is that dysfunction is actually intensifying and accelerating. The First World War broke out in 1914. Destructive and cruel wars motivated by fear, greed, and the desire for power has been common occurrences throughout human history, as had slavery, torture, and widespread violence inflicted for religious and ideological reasons. Humans suffered more at the hands of each other than through natural disasters. By the year 1914, however, the highly intelligent human mind had invented not only the internal combustion engine, but also bombs, machine guns, submarines, flamethrowers, and poison gas. Intelligence in the service of madness. In static trench warfare in France and Belgium, millions of men perished to gain a few miles of mud. When the war was over in 1918, the survivors looked in horror and incomprehension upon the devastation left behind. 10 million human beings killed, and many more maimed or disfigured. Never before had human madness been so destructive in its effect, so clearly visible. Little did they know that this was only the beginning. By the end of the century, the number of people who had died a violent death at the hand of their fellow humans would rise to more than 100 million. They died not only through wars between nations, but also through mass exterminations and genocide, such as the number of 20 million class enemies, spies and traitors in the Soviet Union under Stalin, or the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. They also died in countless smaller internal conflicts, such as the Spanish Civil War or during the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, when a quarter of that country's population was murdered. We only need to watch the daily news on television to realize that the madness has not abated, that it is continuing into the 21st century. Another aspect of the collective dysfunction of the human mind is the unprecedented violence that humans are inflicting on other life forms and the planet itself, the destruction of oxygen-producing forests and other plant and animal life, ill treatment of animals in factory farms, and poisoning of rivers, oceans, and air. Driven by greed, ignorant of their connectedness to the whole, humans persist in behavior that, if continued unchecked, can only result in their own destruction. The collective manifestations of the insanity that lies at the heart of the human condition constitute the greater part of human history. It is to a large extent a history of madness. If the history of humanity were the clinical case history of a single human being, the diagnosis would have to be chronic paranoid delusions, a pathological propensity to commit murder and acts of extreme violence and cruelty against his perceived enemies, his own unconsciousness projected outward. Criminally insane with a few brief lucid intervals. Fear, greed, and the desire for power are the psychological motivating forces not only behind warfare and violence between nations, tribes, religions, and ideologies, but also the cause of incessant conflict in personal relationships. They bring about a distortion in your perception of other people and yourself. Through them, you misinterpret every situation, leading to misguided action designed to rid you of fear and satisfy your need for more, a bottomless hole that can never be filled. It is important to realize, however, that fear, greed, and a desire for power are not the dysfunction that we are speaking of, but are themselves created by the dysfunction, which is deep-seated, collective delusion that lies within the mind of each human being. A number of spiritual teachings tell us to let go of fear and desire, but those spiritual practices are usually unsuccessful. They haven't gone to the root of the dysfunction. Fear, greed, and desire for power are not the ultimate causal factors. Trying to become a good or better human being sounds like a commendable and high-minded thing to do, yet it is an endeavour you cannot ultimately succeed in unless there is a shift in consciousness. This is because it is still part of the same dysfunction, a more subtle and rarefied form of self-enhancement, of desire for more, and a strengthening of one's conceptual identity, one's self-image. You do not become good by trying to be good, but by finding the goodness that is already within you, and allowing that goodness to emerge. But it can only emerge if something fundamental changes in your state of consciousness. The history of communism, originally inspired by noble ideas, clearly illustrates what happens when people attempt to change external reality, create a new earth, without any prior change in their inner reality, their state of consciousness. They make plans without taking into account the blueprint for dysfunction that every human being carries within, the ego. And that brings us to the end of this section. And quite often with Eckhart's books, they're very clearly written and very direct. So often there's not much to explain or elaborate on. But as we read on with this book and each recording, if there's any lines or sections that catch my attention, as was the case in The Power of Now, we can of course go over any of those points. So the two sentences I want to touch on here is where mind is defined as Maya or dukkha. That is to say that ultimately anything or any happiness within the mind is only temporary, that eventually suffering will occur in the mind. And often it's talked about fear and desire, of overcoming fear and desire, to core driving forces of where we do everything. And Eckhart is saying here that a lot of teachings talk about fear and desire and overcoming these and becoming a good person. But often the root is not addressed. And in the last line, that is said here, the blueprint for dysfunction that every human being carries within is the ego. And it is the ego that causes the actions of fear and desire. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. I wish you well, and I will speak to you again very soon. Take care.